Okay, good morning, America, and good afternoon to England. Today, I'm dealing with the city of Prague. Prague is fantastic. Prague is beautiful. It is a city of fact and fiction. It is full of legend and myth, mystery, marvels, and it is quite magical. And that's not just only the city itself and its bridges and its buildings and its clocks, but it's also the stories of individuals that have occupied 1,000 years of Prague, the last 1,000 years of Prague history. Today, I want to start with slide one with the Czech composer Dvorak, which many of you would be familiar with. He is famous as a 19th century composer of the Ninth Symphony from the New World. And this reflects his 3 years which he spent in America, in New York. And much of the music of the magnificent symphony is inspired by America. He would speak, interestingly, of his profound influence of Wagner. And Wagner, he said, was a major influence on all the composers of his generation. Dvorak recalls Wagner's many visits to Prague, and he said in 1863, I was perfectly crazy about him. And of Prague, Wagner said, as on the slide in front of you, splendor and beauty of Prague, a city beyond compare. And it's not often that I quote Wagner, but that is exactly his words. Now, Czech history is complex due to its location, and I've used this particular slide on this particular map because it is of 1938 and it shows exactly how they were often viewed, where the Große Reich, which is Greater Germany, of Germany and Austria, represents, as it were, the head of a wolf or a dog. And in the mouth of the dog is Czechoslovakia, there to be engulfed. Czechoslovakia, as it was until recent times, included the territory of Bohemia, of Moravia, and of Czech Silesia. And it had a history where it was part of the Holy Roman Empire, then part of the Austrian Empire, and then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And parts of Czechoslovakia after 1918 contained many, many different ethnic groups. The main ones were the Germans, the Poles, and Hungarians. German as a language was viewed as a language of the upper classes, the educated, the literary, the writers. They would speak German. And then there were the Jews. And the Jews had been in Prague, in the capital, the largest city of Czechoslovakia, for 1,000 years, and by now, much over 1,000 years. Prague is still the center, but it is the capital and has been since the 14th century of an independent Republic of Czech since 1993, and it's there in the center of Europe. The Jews had lived in Prague since the year 965. And the history of the Jews in Prague is similar to the history of the Jews of Czechoslovakia and the history of the Jews of Europe. It is a roller coaster of fortune, good, bad, indifferent, great, and awful. There were anti-Jewish laws and the usual stories of blood libels, host desecration, massacres, expulsions. Yet, in 1270, the most famous synagogue, possibly and arguably in the world, was built. And this represented the flourishing Jewish life. And this is known as the Alt Neue Shul, which will translate today as the Old New Synagogue. And within this area, within this Jewish center, would become some of the major emphases of the Jewish world. There is nothing finer than looking at the Haggadah used on Seder night and Passover than the printing presses of this area. And in 1535, there would be a Pinkas Shul synagogue, which we'll come to. This synagogue is not just a synagogue, but is associated with the history of the Jews of Prague and some of the greatest personalities of that period. And one of them, who we will also come on to later, would Rabbi Loew, who in his golden age between 1570 and 1620, who would be one of the great rabbis of European history. And he would be associated not with only his facts, his writings, his education, but also with much of the myth and the mystique of who he was and his relationships with the leaders of Czech Jewry. He was associated also with the court Jew of Mordechai Meisel. In 1680, there were attacks on Jews again, and it would result in golden letters on the Charles Bridge. In 1701, 300 years ago and a bit, 28% of Prague was Jewish. There were many synagogues, some of which have now disappeared. But one of them you can still see today is the Pinkas Synagogue. It is the second oldest surviving synagogue in Prague. Its origins are associated with the great Horowitz family. And the floor of the synagogue is, as you can still see on the slide from below, is below ground level. So it was invariably affected by floods. It was always having to have repair work done, and there was always damage. The grill contains within it as well the emblem of the Jewish community, which was a Star of David with a Middle Ages Jewish hat. Today, it is administered by the Jewish Museum in Prague. Now, when recounting all these different aspects of the Jewish world of Prague, they are part of the museum. We often and invariably associate a museum with an individual building, maybe a building and a bit more. But here in Prague, nearly all the synagogues and the cemetery and everything associated with it are all included, even if they're not next to each other, as part of what is known as the museum in Prague, the Jewish Museum. Now, the Pinkas Synagogue is unfortunately also famous for on the wall there, and it's been renewed and restored as a result of flood damage and age and not being kept up. There are some 78,000 or 80,000 victims of Czech or Moravian victims, Jewish victims of the Shoah, of the Holocaust. The names are arranged not just by letters, by their names, but you can see it varies from one to the other, doesn't quite follow through. That is because they're arranged by communities, where the individuals were from, what their birth was, and their date of death. You can see here, as you follow through, date of death, that would be the 10th month of 1944. Or here 1942, and it would be all the way through 1942, 1942, 1943. So all these are dates during the Holocaust. The Pinkas Synagogue is also famous, it's not in front of you there, for an exhibition of children's art, which took place in Theresienstadt, or Theresian, which is some 49 kilometers from Prague. These were all drawn and inspired by a teacher in Theresian known as Friedeldicke Brandeis. And she would encourage the children to paint as an expression of how they felt about living in a ghetto, of how living in Theresian. Their pictures are a testimony to what and how the children lived at the times they lived in. Most of the children were accompanied by Friedeldicke Brandeis all the way to Auschwitz and into the gas chamber, where they would die, and she would accompany them to their deaths. Before she was taken to Auschwitz, She hid many of the paintings, which can be seen in the Spinker synagogue to this very day, and there are around 4,500 preserved paintings from pictures from those children from those times. Other parts, again, of the museum are other famous synagogues, some more beautiful than the other, some restored and some not so much. The Meisel synagogue is located again in the Jewish quarter and is a response of the generosity of Mordechai Meisel in 1590. It has been affected by fire, and during the Nazi occupation, the properties of the Jewish community were all stored in the Meisel synagogue. After World War II, it became part of the Jewish Museum. The Clausen synagogue was also is a response to the generosity of the same gentleman, Mordechai Meisel, and he decided to build what was known as a Clausen synagogue, or a Kleutz. And it is a combination of buildings, including a synagogue, a Talmud Torah, and a place for the rabbi and for the famous Maharal of Prague. The synagogue was completed in 1884 after a lot of destruction, and it became the Jewish part of the Jewish Museum in Prague. The last one here is the beautiful Spanish synagogue. It is, or it was in its day, a Reform synagogue. This is the 19th century, the rise of the Reform movement, completed in 1868 in a Moorish style, a style which the Jews in Europe wanted to copy from Spain and from North Africa. This was built on what was known as the Altschule, on the old shul. It again was included into the museum. During the Second World War, it was confiscated and used by the Nazis for the storage of many of the contents from Czechoslovakia. Now, one of the places you go and visit when you're in Prague is the Prague City Hall. It is a new building. It is very attractive. It is Art Nouveau, and it contains much art on it representing the activity and the demonstrable workings of the Prague community, not the Jews, of the Prague community. And it is in a square where there used to be what was known as the Church of the Virgin Mary at the Puddle, which is rather an interesting title because there again, it flooded a lot. So flooding was a problem in Prague. On the corners, as you walk round the Prague City Hall, you come across two aspects. One corner, there's something known as the Iron Knight, but more importantly, more famously, more absolutely Prague-Jurian of Prague is a statue of Rabbi Loew, known as the Maharal. This statue is done by Saloon, who died in 1946, and he is a representative of Czech Art Nouveau. Saloon was commissioned to work on producing artistic sculptures for different areas of Prague. Said he, on the other side, he was talking about the other side of where the Iron Knight is, I couldn't have placed a better figure than the learned and mysterious Rabbi Loew, who incorporated everything that the most noble old ghetto of Prague produced. Rabbi Loew was a symbol of the ghetto. He is one of the most famous of Czech rabbis. There are books written by him. There are educational advice given to him that was from 500 years ago and is still relevant today. But the more important thing is to look at the detail that Saloon produced in the mysterious way of the rabbi, the chief rabbi. It is known that he met with the emperor, and he was known for his magical ways and mysterious ways as if they couldn't destroy him, his life would continue on. And it was believed that his life could not be interrupted by normal occurrences. But there is a story, a magical story of Rabbi Loew amongst many of the stories. And it is said that at a point when he was in the process of learning and studying, there are different stories, learning and studying and contemplating life itself, that moment his granddaughter came over to him with a rose. And she gave him a rose, and seeing his granddaughter, he couldn't not take the rose. But in that rose was the angel of death. And as he took the rose from her, he smelt it and he realized what had happened. And that was the cause of his death at that moment. Now, Saloon has taken this story and has adapted it, because suddenly you have along the side of the rabbi here is a naked woman, which was not in the original story, but it gives it more excitement and more interest. And on his left hand, he is holding it up as if to say, don't do it. No, as if to prevent himself from actually the realization that his death was about to come. And the rose which had been in his hand falls onto the plinth which is in front of him. And next to him is a dog. The dog, the rose, a representation in an incorrect but artistic way of a woman that would have been his granddaughter. This statue is visited by thousands of people who have no knowledge of who Rabbi Loew was, but they know all about him, and they'll know more about him in a moment. The size of this is enormous. The actual height of it is 18 foot from the base of the plinth to the top. And the height of the statue of the rabbi is some just under 12 foot high. There is a photograph of Max Brod and Franz Kafka together with the rabbi in an anthology of the 20th century known Das Jüdische Prague, the Jewish Prague. In 1940, when the Nazis were in Prague, the community, under the instructions maybe of the Nazis, removed the statue to preserve it and prevent it from being destroyed. And after the war, it was returned to where it is now, that you can see. And as I say, people glance at that, at the wonder of the Rabbi Loew, known as the Maharal, Moreno Harav Loew. But he is even more famous for the establishment of the story of the Golem. A golem is a legend about the creation out of the mud of the Vltava River, the Moldau River, where the mud would be able to create a human being, a mystical concept which goes back not only into Jewish thought, into Jewish theology, not only in the Talmud, but in many, many spheres of legends in other nations as well. Now, Rabbi Loew, it is said, created this golem in order to protect the Jewish community, that he could put this giant of a man, which would give rise to the ideas of Frankenstein, but with this giant of a man to protect the Jewish community against the accusations of blood libel, specifically on Seder night. This legend passed on ages upon ages, country upon country. It probably first appeared in 1846 in stories of George Weisel in a collection of legends. One of the major legends is that this was only controllable by the creator. In this story, the Maharal, Rabbi Loew, created the golem. And when you walk around Prague today, you see images of the golem everywhere. You have a golem restaurant, a golem sandwich, a golem bar, a golem whatever. And the way it is preserved is because the Hebrew letters here, which is the first letter, the final letter, and the middle letter of the Hebrew alphabet, is the word emet, meaning truth. And whilst that word emet, truth, was on the golem would survive, would live, and protect the Jewish community. But the story is told that on one particular occasion, and this story goes back into Helm as well, into the 16th century and other places, that this golem went crazy. And the only way that he could be controlled is that somehow the Maharal rubbed out the letter Aleph from the golem. And when you take away the Aleph from the word emet, meaning truth, you are left with the letters Mem, Taf, which means death. And at that point, the golem died. The only wondrous thing about this story is that the Maharal of Prague was dead and buried centuries before the story of the golem actually came about. It is a prime example of what we call pseudepigraphical. In other words, if you attach a particular concept to a particular famous person, it becomes more important. But certainly the Maharal of Prague, although everybody knows in speech mark that he is responsible for the golem, never knew anything about it, and the golem is a future creation. It is said, even to this day, however, that on Friday night in a service in the Prague main synagogue, there is a particular prayer which is said at the beginning of the Sabbath, which is Psalm 92. And this particular psalm is said twice in the synagogue in Prague. It is the only synagogue in the world where the prayer is said twice. Why is that? Because the legend continues. It is said that the Maharal was too busy on a Friday evening, early Friday evening, destroying the golem to protect the community, and at that moment missed the saying of the prayer introducing the Sabbath. So as a result, they then repeated it when he entered into the synagogue. The legend produced a fact, and the fact is the prayer is said twice, even if the Maharal never knew about the golem and never put the golem down on the eve of the Sabbath. But it continues on. One of the mystical parts of Prague is also the cemetery. There are thousands of gravestones, 100,000 graves in this cemetery. It is one of the largest Jewish cemeteries in Europe and one of the most important. It contains within it the bones, the remains of some of the most famous people of the Prague community, such as we just mentioned, Rabbi Loew, the Maharal, the businessman Mordechai Meisel, responsible as a businessman for the building of the Meisel synagogue and more, the historian David Gans, and many others. And it is administered by the Jewish Museum. It is a cemetery which existed from the middle of the 15th century all the way to 1787. Only one problem for the Jews in Prague was the authorities wouldn't allow them to expand the size of the cemetery. Thus, and therefore, they came to the conclusion that the only way these people could be buried was that they would be buried vertically, one after another, layer after a layer. So there are underneath these tombstones, which are completely haphazard because they don't absolutely correspond to the person underneath. There are as many as 12 people buried level after level after level, so that there are 12,000 tombstones here for 100,000 graves. And many of them commemorate many people. Some of these gravestones are you can see the passage of time of how and why they exist. What's interesting about going to the cemetery is it's higher up. Why is it higher than the surrounding area? It's simply because with the graves being added one after another, the hill got higher and higher and higher. Now, one of the most famous graves is, of course, in the famous, what would be called a matzeva, or a tombstone, or an ohel, where they develop it like a tent, is of the Maharal himself and his wife. Now, they are buried. His wife here on the right is Pearl, and he, the famous Maharal, is buried on the left. There are symbols. You begin to get this as later on by the 17th century, 18th century, a lot of beautiful work which went on tombstones which had representations. So not on this one, but another one, you may see a hand representing a Kohen. You may see a picture of water representing a Levi. You may see a book or something to do with it representing a scribe. Here you see bunches of grapes, and they represent the idea of the land of Israel, of fertility, and of wisdom. Also in the center here is the heraldic lion of Bohemia, and the lion is heavily associated with Rabbi Loew because he is known, of course, that the lion is the lion of Judah, and his name was Judah, the tribe of Judah associated with the lion. And the lion, of course, is his name, which is Loew, which is the same as lion. Although we have the ohel here, we can't see the side of it. It's like a small tent for famous people or others who would pay for it. He is not actually buried in it, but under it. Nobody goes to Prague. Nobody goes to Prague without going on the Charles Bridge. The Charles Bridge is arguably the most famous bridge in the world. Now, I remember going in a cab journey to Prague, and the cab driver telling me that there are 30 statues on it, 15 on one side and 15 on the other, that all of them were original. But I had to disappoint the cab driver, that in reality, none of them are actually original, because there have been fires and earthquakes and floods and destruction and all variety of things, which means that many of the statues are held in museums in other places, and every single one is a replica. The Child Bridge is one of 18 bridges across the Moldau, or the Vltava, the same name, different name. One is a Czech name, one a German name. And it is named the Child Bridge after the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV. And it is built on top of the Judith Bridge, which was destroyed and demolished some 15 years before. Now, the Child Bridge its flows are under the bridge, is the Vltava, or the Moldau, which is the longest river in the Czech Republic, referred to as the Czech National River. In the narrative of the Golem, created mystically, and we know it wasn't so, but mystically, and it's still part of the story, it is made out of the clay of the banks of the Vltava River, which is here in front of us. There is one interesting aside. You may say, well, why is the music of the Israeli national anthem here? If you go away, and as well as listening to the music from the New World to inspire you for the music of Dvorak, be inspired also by the music of Smetana, who was Smetana and Dvorak were the two famous Czech composers. Smetana composed this music called the Moldau Vltava, and the opening bars are incredibly similar to the opening bars of the Hatikva, the national anthem of Israel. Some people argue, and there's a phenomenal amount written, that the Hatikva music is based on Smetana's music. Many, if not most, authorities would say it is a mere coincidence, and it is not quite so. And that the music, in fact, of the Hatikva goes back as much as 600 years and is involved with Italian music, but we won't dwell on that. So, all of you, with a knowledge of a palindrome, most famously would be the name Hannah, Hannah. It is something which reads the same both ways. Is why have I shown here a palindrome over the Charles Bridge, over the center of the Vltava River in Prague? Because when it came to be built, the Emperor King Charles IV was highly superstitious, as people were in the 14th century, and he wanted and consulted with astronomers and others as to when he should build the bridge. And the year which they built the bridge, some 15 years after the end of the Judith Bridge, was in the year 1357. And going according to the astronomers and others at the same time, it was decided that it should be put up, the first brick of it, as it were, for this was a new stone bridge, on the 9th of July. And finally, the astronomers and those mystics had the final word as to the time they should do it, would be at 5:31 in the morning. And so the palindrome was created. This palindrome actually can be seen if you look, most unsavory, but it's by the toilet at the entrance to the bridge somewhere down there. You can actually see the numbers inscribed. But it's so 135797531, the most famous palindrome to do with the Charles Bridge. But the fame of the Charles Bridge does not end there, because in the most of all the 30 statues which are there, the most recognizable, the most interesting, the most bizarre is one of a crucifixion of Jesus Christ in Calvary, and that's why it's known as the crucifix in Calvary, is on the bridge there as you go along. You'll see it fairly soon on the right-hand side. And it was established in 1657. But why are there Hebrew letters? And what do the Hebrew letters mean? And what's the allusion? The gold letters were not there originally. They were added on, and they are in Hebrew. It says here, Kadosh, 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 Hashem Sevaot. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. And these are words which come from Isaiah chapter 6, verse 3, which is considered one of the most spiritual 3 words in the book of Isaiah. And these words are part and parcel of the service in the synagogue, where they are repeated with great reverence while standing. On the right-hand side here is John the Baptist, and on the left is Mary. It is the only statue which has John the Baptist and Mary. Goes the story. In 1696, there was a Jew alive back often, and there are different stories. We will go according to the one which is most popular. And he said that, as it were, it had a bad day in the office. And he's wandering along, coming back, and he sees in front of him the last thing a Jew wants to see in those days where Jews were oppressed is a crucifix. And he swears at the crucifix, and he blasphemes the cross, and he is seen, and he is chased, and he escapes into the Jewish quarter in Yosefov. He escapes into it, and the Jewish community refuses to give him up. The Jewish community is punished. And they are punished by having to pay for the establishment of the gold letters from the Jewish prayer, which is also seen in many ways as part of the Sanctus and Benedictus of the Eucharist, because holy, 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 that's a trilogy that is also seen in a way as holy in Christianity as well. And the INRI here goes above it, which is exceedingly well known, of course, which is Latin, which is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And he was punished by an insult on the Jewish community. They think they are special. We will insult them, so every time they pass it by, they will realize that the holiest part of their prayers is being used as mocking them. When the Nazis came along, they removed all of this. The INRI and the holy, holy, holy is the Lord of Hosts was removed, and it was replaced after the war. What's interesting is that when they replaced it, the person replacing it made an error. And the particular letter here is the Aleph, which is the wrong way round. And it's been left as such. There were, by the year 2000, many complaints, and a number of American rabbis were traveling through Prague, and seeing this, they complained that this was completely unjust, that the Jews should be insulted in this way, considering everything and considering their treatment at the hand of the Germans and the Christians and everybody else. And therefore today there is a plaque which is beneath the cross where you can't see it. And here and that explains exactly what has gone on. Another statue is Saint Cyril and Methodius. Now, this one's actually established quite late, about 1928 to 39, and in that period. And it was donated by Czechoslovakia. These are, Cyril and Methodius are Greek brothers, missionaries, and these saints are baptizing the Slavs, that's to make the Slavs of Czechoslovakia into Christians. And today they are national saints, and there is a national holiday. But we will return to the importance of the church of Cyril and Methodius. Next to the river, by the river, is the Ridolfinum, a beautiful building known as the Seat of the Muses, built in 1885. And it was in honor, called that, of Ridolfinum, in honor of Rudolf, Crown Prince of Austria. Dvorak, when he returned from America with his symphony from the New World for the first time in Prague, this is where he played it. Between 1940 and 42, the building was then used by the Nazis, and it was to be the place where Hitler was to have concerts and other things and celebrate his birthday. A book you need to get, and a book you need to read, as well as listening to music, you need to read the book, because this is a book known by Yuri Weil, is known as Mendelssohn is on the Roof. And in the mystique and the mystery of Prague, it just fits in so well. Because, of course, Yuri Weil is a magnificent writer, and he wrote a novel with his fact and fiction combined together about the history and the awfulness of the Holocaust on Czech Jewry. And it's called Mendelssohn is on the Roof, because it is alleged that as the war was commencing, in the early part, that Reinhard Heydrich, before allowing Hitler to have his presentation in the Ridolfinum, could not possibly have a statue, could not possibly have the bust of a Jew like Mendelssohn, even though he had been converted, could not have him there on the roof of the Ridolfinum. And the whole beginning of the book is this humorous, slightly humorous story of where the Nazis send up two soldiers and say, you've got to get rid of them. And they then say, well, who is he? What does he look like? We don't know what he looks like. And so they called upon a rabbi, and the rabbi comes along and says, well, I'm an expert in many things, but to be honest, I have not got a clue. But the soldiers went along and they decided that the bust with the biggest nose would be the Jew. And they began to remove the bust before they were stopped from taking it down because they had picked on the bust of Wagner. And they were going to remove the wrong bust. What's interesting about this story, and it's the beginning of the book before it becomes more serious, the plot of the novel is one thing and reality is completely another. Indeed, you would find Mendelssohn is on the roof today because his bust is there. Richard Wagner's is not there, and it never was there. But it makes a very interesting beginning to a very interesting and very powerful book. The man responsible for much of what went on in Prague was, of course, Reinhard Heydrich, who we just met just before about the removal of the bust in the beginning of the book. Heydrich was cultured, smart, ex-Navy, Nazi party member, vicious, Aryan, and Himmler's right-hand man. It was Hitler, Himmler, Heydrich. He was arrogant, he was a cynical sadist, and he was responsible for Gleiwitz in 1939, which was a makeup of the invasion by the Poles of Germany, which was completely manufactured by the Germans, and where a number of people were killed, and they were all taken from a concentration camp, and it was never actually so. And he was also, of course, with Eichmann at Wannsee in 1942, where in that part of Berlin, they discussed the detail of the final solution. He then was responsible, he gave his name to it, Operation Reinhard, which was the murder of Polish Jewry. He was the Deputy Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, and he was assassinated by one Czech and one Slovak in May 1942. And this is exactly the picture of the result of the attack on his car. He died soon afterwards. Those who were involved in the assassination, along with others who were fighting the resistance against the Nazis, retired to St. Cyril and Methodius Church. And this is what it looks like today. And they hid in the crypt, and the crypt was filled with water in order to drown them out. Everybody within that crypt, ultimately, if they hadn't been killed during the battle for that crypt, then committed suicide, including the two Czechoslovak gentlemen, soldiers who had assassinated Heydrich. One of the most beautiful parts of Prague is the Old Town Square. You have a Gothic church here, Our Lady before Tin, which means a courtyard, and of course the famous astronomical clock, which has the ability to show you everything you could possibly ever want to know about the movement of the stars and the planets and time in 24 hours or any makeup of any hours. And it would have the solar and the lunar clocks as well. This area here in the square was the focal point of Nazi, or should I say, Czech resistance against the Nazis. The Old Town Hall here was heavily damaged, and the resistance also caused damage to the astronomical clock. In the Jewish Town Hall, a bit further away, was constructed in 1586 by Meisels, and it was the meeting house of the Jewish community. It is famous for a Hebrew clock, which goes by its usual letters of 1, 2, that's Aleph is 1 o'clock, and that's Yud Bet, which is 12 o'clock, and here the clock is going anti-clockwise, and the clock is still there. This area here of this Jewish town hall was to be used by the Nazis for a museum of an extinct race, whereby everything collected in Czechoslovakia was to be brought into this area and stored all the holy aspects of the Jewish world. They also here were forced to write all the lists for the deportations. In 1935, there were 35,500 Jews in Prague. In 1940, there were 55,000 Jews in Prague. And we've already seen a list of 80,000 Jews who were murdered throughout Prague and more. And ultimately, from this area, the Jewish area is now a museum piece, and 1,000 years of Jewish history came to an end. Of those who were murdered in the Holocaust were the three sisters of Franz Kafka. Now, Kafka has a monument which is a bizarre Kafkaesque idea with a vacant head, and all of this part has rotating pieces. And if you attend here to see, every 15 minutes, different parts of this particular statue rotate. Kafka is the most famous Jew in the literary world in Prague. So you have here the Maharal, the Golem. You can see how much of Prague history has its content filled with Jewish people and Jewish ideas and Jewish concepts. He was a middle-class speaking Jew. He spoke, studied law. He was also schizoid, depressive, suicidal. He was a womanizer. He never married. He had a disagreement. He didn't really like his father. Wrote a long letter to his father. He was ambivalent about his Judaism. He had wanted all his work destroyed. He had a most awful life and died of TB at a very young age of 40. And he only had one work, a major work, which was actually printed in his lifetime, which was Metamorphosis. The Trial and the Castle were both finished after his death, and he didn't have that much fame during his life. There is now a very Kafkaesque museum, which is black and dark and bizarre, which is you can go into as well. And he's buried in the Jewish cemetery. As we come to the end, there are parts of Prague which are just a little bit of a walk away. And one of them is Jerusalem Synagogue, also known as the Jubilee Synagogue. It was known as a Jubilee Synagogue in the 1906, named in honor of Franz Joseph on his Jubilee, Franz Joseph of Austria. When, of course, the Austrians were kicked out or whatever, and they were defeated of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the name was changed from the Jubilee Synagogue to the Jerusalem Synagogue, and it's in Jerusalem Street. That's the name. It was used during the war with confiscated Jewish property. It is, as you can see just from this picture, that it is stunningly beautiful. Up the road from the Jerusalem Synagogue, we end with a bit of American history and a bit of pride and good people. There is a Woodrow Wilson monument created by the Czech Americans, and outside the major station of Prague, the main station of Prague. And he was the 28th president of the United States, and he is honored because he fought for the independence of Czechoslovakia after World War I in 1918. The station was for a while named after him. The statue was torn down by the Nazis and was then put back again by the American Czech friends of Czechoslovakia. The Prague main railway station is stunningly beautiful. This is just a touch, just a minute piece of the magnificent, which you can see, the Art Nouveau chamber, the Art Nouveau pillars, the Art Nouveau cafeteria, the Art Nouveau ticket offices, and it all come together in this neo-Renaissance style, which was from 1871. There was again, Saloon, who did the statue of the Maharal, was involved also in some of the statue work in the train station. It was modernized, and you have to go and visit. Let me end with one man, Sir Nicholas Winton. He was born just around the corner from where I live here in London, in Hampstead. And he was born to Jewish parents, Rudolf Wertheim, the Wertheim bank manager, and Barbara Wertheimer. And they both, at some point in 1907, decided that there was no future in Germany and wanted to move to London. Nicholas Winton was not particularly Jewish. In fact, many people don't and didn't even realize that he was Jewish. But he worked as a stockbroker and became a humanitarian aid for Jewish children whose families had fled persecution from Nazi Germany or persecution within Czechoslovakia. Winston, on his own, Winton assisted in the rescue of 669 children from Czechoslovakia on the eve of World War II. On a brief visit to Czechoslovakia, he helped himself compiled a list of all the children, and he nearly got all the children on his list out, except for one carriage, which was stopped when war was declared, and he couldn't get them out to be saved. And it also always tore part of his heart out that he didn't manage that. The operation was not the Kindertransport, but was known as a Czech Kindertransport. Nobody knew about him. He was a quiet individual, but there was a TV program in around 1988 called That's Life. And Esther Ranson, a Jewish lady who happened to be the front person of this program, would interview famous people. On one particular occasion, she interviews Nicholas Winton, and he heard and he learnt that there were people out there who knew what he had done to save Jewish children. And about this, he began to speak about it on TV for the first time, about something he had never mentioned before. Esther Ranson says, and the woman sitting next to you, in the audience next to you, was one of the children that you saved, now an elderly lady, was one of those saved. And she turns to the audience and says, is there anybody else in this audience who was saved by Nicholas Winton? And every single person in the whole audience, chair after chair, row after row, block after block, all stand in honor of Nicholas Winton. They'd all come together. He was honored, knighted, as you can see, sir, by Elizabeth II, and awarded the highest honor of the Czech Republic. If you go to platform 1 of the train station, and it is similar to that which you can see in Liverpool Street Station, where there are 2 monuments to Nicholas Winton, there you have a statue of Nicholas Winton with 2 children and a suitcase that he helped to save those 669 children. There's also a plaque there on the wall, which you can't quite see here, about him saving the Jewish children from German occupiers. The children never saw their parents again, and the plaque is a monument to the 15,131 children of Prague who were murdered by the Nazis. So we've seen in Prague, it is a city which spreads over hundreds of years of hundreds of personalities, of wonderful individuals, of absolutely fantastic stories. And there are books to read and music to listen to. And on that note, I will leave it over to answer any of your questions, if I can. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we'll go through these. David Garfield starts with a comment. I believe that he spent his time mainly in Iowa, not New York.
That may well be. I bow to your knowledge. It is said, however, that according to the writings about him, that he spent his time in New York, but he may have been in New York for a bit and Iowa for a bit, but that's quite possible.
Hindi says, if you are in Prague, it's definitely worthwhile to take the tour of the Jewish museums, synagogues, and I think that some of the children's art was published years ago in a beautiful book called I Never Saw Another Butterfly.
Yes, correct. That's so. That book is so. You can see much of that material there today in the when you go to Prague. You can also, some people will go to Terezin, which is, as what I said, is some 49 kilometers, 49 miles away from Prague and is worthy of a visit as well. But that book is well known. There are many books that are written about the history of Prague and many of the individuals that were there.
We have an amazing connection here. Eva says, my aunt Hanna Volokova was a survivor of Terezin, an art historian and director of the Jewish Museum after World War II. It was her idea to have the names inscribed on the walls of the Pinchas synagogue. She was also the editor of the book of children's drawings and poems from Terezin.
Well, thank you very much for that. She was a very special lady, your aunt. So she did a wonderful job. Terezin was was a concentration camp of a sort, not a killing camp, but it was a fake and used by the Nazis famously for the Danish Red Cross who had come there, and the Jews had been instructed to paint it and look as if it was a normal life, which it wasn't. They fooled the Red Cross, but people maybe stood a better chance for a little while of surviving in Terezin than other places. Yeah.
Another personal connection here. Gail says, my ancestor David Gans is buried in that cemetery.
Ah, yeah.
Um, let's see. Rosemary asks, how does the statue of Rabbi Loew fit in with the precept of no graven images?
But can you just say that a bit louder? Sorry, I only got to find it.
How does the statue of Rabbi Loew fit in with the precept of no graven images?
Okay, well, no graven images is an old subject which goes back to the very beginning of time as to whether Judaism allowed, based on the Ten Commandments, that we can have a graven image. This issue is brought about, first of all, the graven image in this case, of course, is not by somebody who's Jewish. So it could be that the matter would be to do with whether a Jew can make something which is a graven image. We take a much more, I would say, liberal view of this particular precept and normally find different ways of getting around it or accepting you can have certain images in certain cases. We certainly do not take an extreme view as in Islam. Although even Islam has not been as extreme as it would be now, where they wouldn't show the face of Muhammad. So we tend to get around that, and that's why some would say that there isn't so much Jewish art because Jews were also slightly not encouraged into that area of activity for the very reason that you've just questioned, or the question you've just brought up. Yep.
There are quite a few people mentioning some additional reads. Nima mentions a marvelous memoir of pre-World War II in Prague called Minuet by Victor Fischl. Um, Anne is mentioning a read about the Underground Reporters by Kathy Kaser. She has a description of that here of young people who publish their own newspaper. And also Sheila notes a book, The Assassination of Heydrich book called HHHH by Laurent
Yeah.
Binet.
Yeah.
Probably you're familiar with so many. Um,
Yeah, the subject of Heydrich, of course, is enormous. One could give, in fact, I've done it. You could give a talk just on the assassination, which was Operation Anthropoid, and involved with that's a big, big story that, as I said at the beginning and said afterwards as well, and thank you for all your points, there are enormous amount written. Just you could spend weeks just reading books of Prague and other such matters. You could read many of Kafka's works uh, and more so. Any other questions?
Yes, yes. Um, is this person says in Toronto, the former deputy head of the Bank of Czechoslovakia was the executive VP international of the Bank of Montreal. He was Joseph D. Jenikov. Do you know whether he was Jewish?
I do not, but I'm sure that Google would.
Indeed.
Yeah, that would be.
We have just so many comments here. I'll just read a couple out for you so you don't go without missing them. But Joan says, want to thank you for these most beautiful presentation filled with so much information and visually pleasing. Adrienne says, thank you for the fabulous presentation. Prague holds a special place in my heart. God willing, I will return. Linda says, heartfelt thanks for your outstanding presentation, which has added so much to my knowledge and appreciation. My father lived in Prague in the 20s and 30s. I've been fortunate to visit twice. He always referred to it as the most beautiful city in the world. Naomi, Don, Nadine, everyone is saying thank you. What an excellent lecture. I'm just seeing if there's any more questions. Many, many more notes of appreciation, though, Charles.
Thank you
Um,
very much, and thank you to you for presenting. And also thank you to everybody for being here. If anybody wants to send me questions or points of information, I'm always here to learn more and more. You can always contact me through Lockdown University in my email address, which I actually had on the first slide. I'm not sure whether that wasn't quite correct. So I'm always available for questions. I must say that when I take my tours to all these different places, going to Prague when I lead a group there, it is quite magical. And I strongly encourage anybody who's not been to just take a visit there. I think I'm talking again soon on another incredibly interesting city, which is Istanbul, with a very interesting history and Jewish history as well.
There's
So,
just one more comment that I think is important to read.
okay.
Marta says,
One.
my grandmother, Marta Blochova's name is on the wall of the Pinkasova synagogue. She died in terrorism. I was named after her. Thank you for everything you do. Thank you,
Well,
Marta.
thank you for that comment as well. It's when you go along and you go to the Pinker Shore and you move along, and how often people will see names which they recognize. It's a very powerful and emotive and emotional moment. And I want to
In-
thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Indeed. Thank you so much for your time, Charles, and have a good afternoon and good evening to everyone
Good
here.
evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye bye.